Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. It is Tuesday, May 6th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with Times of Israel founding editor David Horovitz. Hi, David.
Hey, Jessica, how you doing?
Okay, it is day 578 of the war. A top Hamas official was reported as to have said this morning that there is, quote, no sense in continuing the hostage ceasefire talks while the, quote, hunger war continues in Gaza. The aid embargo has entered its third month. We'll talk about the Israeli strike in Yemen last night following a Houthi missile that hit Ben Gurion airport on Sunday. What is the latest in Gaza? And the Israeli cabinet's rejection of the Attorney General's call for a state commission probe of October 7th. We'll also talk about some comments made by U.S. Special Envoy to the Mideast, Steve Witkoff. So stay with us. Okay, David, let's start with Yemen because that was sort of the one of the later evening events of last night. Not unexpected that would have happened, that there would have been an Israeli strike on Yemen following this Houthi missile that actually fell in the airport that has now caused all of these airlines to cancel their flights. And of course, just having a missile hit the airport. What are your thoughts about that now that we've seen this thing happen that we've sort of expected to happen for the last couple of days?
Well, the what's amazing, I suppose, about the missile attack in the first place by the Houthis is the degree to which this was a shock, because we've come to, even though the defense experts always tell us there is no hermetic seal, and the Israel's capacity to intercept missiles is astonishing and probably the best in the world. Not everything is going to be intercepted. It was still very surprising that a missile got through, and of course that it got through at the airport, which is, in terms of Israel's access to the world and the world's access to Israel, incredibly central, obviously. And it fell a few hundred yards from the control tower and Terminal 3, which is the main terminal that we all use at the airport for most flights. And obviously there was going to be an Israeli response, and it's been a relatively powerful Israeli response. But the sense that has always been conveyed, shall we say, by the military top brass, has been a bit of helpless bafflement about these Houthis. I remember somebody very senior saying very, very early on in the stages where the Houthis had started to get involved, we really, they're crazy. That's actually what that person said, a very senior military official. And they're not obviously going to be easily deterred. And therefore, the question is, however potent a series of airstrikes, how effective are they going to be? You have this contrast between a very, very poor, divided, essentially failed state, and a tendency sometimes to ridicule the Houthis at the same time as they obviously have not only the capacity to import missiles and weaponry, which Israel and the United States and others are trying to stop, but also some domestic capacity as well. I mean, it's astonishing that when you have nothing else, very much the same as Gaza, just a lot further away, nonetheless, you're devoting all your resources and expertise as your people are impoverished and barely fed to try and manufacture means to kill people. But the conclusion to date has been that airstrikes, however potent, are not going to stop the Houthis. And then, people are talking not of an Israeli invasion, heaven forbid, 2,000 miles away, 2,000 kilometers away, or anybody else's, but from within Yemen and arming other forces within Yemen. I think that's been tried before, including with support and of the Saudis and others. This is not a challenge that is going to fade, and I I think one can assume that the defense establishment, rather than sort of holding up its hands in kind of helpless bafflement, knows that it has to find some kind of more potent way to stop the Houthis, because I don't think that they will easily be persuaded to stop. And there's even the sense, I mean, I don't know if this is still felt to be the case, that they don't heed the Iranians particularly. Presumably,
Mm,
if Iran was under tremendous pressure of a degree that it isn't at the moment and was
right.
desperate, they would be making more of an effort to stop the Houthis. But it may be that, broadly speaking, the Houthis are not always heeding the instructions of their Iranian supporters, funders, masters. You know, it's not as linear as that.
I mean, it's as you and I have spoken about this before over the last year and a half more, there's an incredible disruption on the part of life of regular Israelis because of the Houthi strikes, whether it's a missile at, 3 a.m. or 2 a.m. or 4 a.m. or 6 a.m. And then this airport strike, people like to sort of in a black humor sense, make fun of the Houthis. But then when it all of a sudden falls, as we said, in Ben Gurion Airport, canceling flights, making life very complicated for people. That's more than just, this distant threat in a
I agree with you,
sense.
and I
That
think there's a tendency to mock them, for example, because their
completely.
spokesperson speaks in a very high voice. Their spokesman, so there must be silly people who can't really do us any harm. And I would also add that, Israelis are incredibly resilient, and people who visit Israel are incredibly resilient. 5 minutes after the all clears are being issued, people are back out. But the airport is a different story. I mean, if you're a foreign airline, and I mean, we know, of course, in terms of insurance and so on and safety, if you're the crew, you're not going to be particularly comfortable unless you really are sophisticated politically and understand how affected Israel is on the whole and that it's a fairly dangerous world out there. Those arguments are all a little bit weaker. Even the fact that the airport, Israel's air space was closed, we should stress this, once the missile was launched. In other words, that it's not like Israel is playing fast and loose here. Of course, we'll be able to stop it and therefore keep things going as usual when it was on its way. No, the airspace is closed as Israel grapples, in this case, failed. Incoming flights, I think you have to say, therefore, were not in danger. But there is danger because they hit the airport, and there are airplanes at the airport, and there are people at the airport. And astonishingly, something like 96% of Houthi missiles fired at Israel are intercepted. That leaves the other 4%.
Yep. Okay, let's turn to Gaza. A lot of headlines on Gaza, of course, and now we have this Hamas official saying, "Why negotiate if we have this aid embargo that just keeps on going?" And that, of course, the Israeli government is saying, "We're going to keep this embargo going." And we, of course, have reservists being called up and back to fighting in Gaza and soldiers who have been killed. And the headlines are returning to what we saw prior to the ceasefire in January. Where do you think the mood is right now in terms of the country and going back to those days, going back to that reality?
So if you're asking about the mood first, I don't know how much one can rely on polling, but consistent polling suggests that something like two-thirds, maybe slightly more, of Israelis um, would have been prepared to stop the war if necessary to get the hostages out, and the government has decided on another option, which is to escalate the war, and has said, and the army has said, to do so with a plan that is intended to minimize the risk to the hostages, because as things stand, it is only military pressure that is going to work on Hamas, because Hamas has been refusing to extend really the first phase of that now collapsed deal and release more hostages without Israel committing to end the war. And that's the deadlock that produced this escalated operation and a major call up. So you have a pretty unpopular new round starting. You have a Hamas that has shown absolute indifference to the well-being of anybody, both Israelis who they want to kill and Gazans who they don't care, are being killed and are hungry, and they've commandeered aid and they've made it very, very difficult for aid to reach the right people. And now you have Hamas officially basically saying, nothing's going to change. We're not gonna release more hostages. We're digging in here, and you have some mixed messaging coming from Israel as well. There's been a lot of stress by the prime minister and the decisions that are being um, issued and set out by the government, stressing that this is the army's plan, that the coalition accepted the army's plan for how to take this forward. But the stresses are different. Netanyahu, the language and semantics, they're subtle here. But Netanyahu said the other day, as we've said in the podcast and as we've reported, of course, that the hostages is not the most important thing. A victory is what you have to do in a war and is the most important thing. And of course, we should say he's made clear the victory involves getting the hostages back. Whereas the stress in the army, even in the prioritizing of whether you say first, we're going to get the hostages back and we're going to destroy Hamas, which is what the army is saying, that's a little different. And all of this is taking place, of course, as you mentioned, where the army is saying we need essentially the Haredim to be conscripted. This is not tenable any longer. You heard this being said by everybody in senior positions in the army, and you have a government that is doing the opposite. That is, because of internal political pressure, because the two ultra-Orthodox parties have repeatedly indicated, I'm not sure that this is true, but maybe, that they will bolt the coalition, the government is desperately trying to get through legislation that will preserve most of the exemption, exclusion, and non-service of the ultra-Orthodox community. Again, the fastest growing community in this country. So you have an increasing proportion of the country not serving at a time when those who serve are serving in the reserve forces, obviously a greater number of days than ever before in the history of Israel. This is now going to be the fourth, fifth, maybe more terms of reserve service for people. We are talking about people, many, many people who have done hundreds upon hundreds of days. And the army is acknowledging that the call-up rate, the response is not as good. It's still very high, and people will continue to serve. There's a huge sense of mutual responsibility. People are in units together with their comrades for years and do not wish to let each other down. If people don't turn up, that's more strain on the others. And there's a recognition that, the Israeli army cannot fall apart. But that's a pretty difficult circumstance in which to be embarking on a highly, potentially highly expanded round of conflict. And also, Jessica, I don't know if it's clear to you, but we report this, but it's not exactly clear what the plan is here. Even the
Right.
wording, we're trying to work out, that there's people talking about a gradually expanding operation to start after President Trump's Middle East visit next week, if there's been no breakthrough since then. How is this going to be different from the first high intensity conflict? Is Israel again going to gradually expand rather than do things in different places at the same time? Is there other elements of surprise that we don't know about that are going to work better? How is the Israeli planning for aiding, getting supplies through to Gazans going to work? It seems in some aspects of it that the vision here is incredibly personal. In other words, that you're dealing with vast numbers of people, and yet on an individual basis, in some cases, families interacting with with aid distribution under IDF supervision in certain areas. I mean, this is not a
Right.
small number of people that you're dealing with. And therefore, at the very least, you have to say it is not clear how well this is going to work, both from a military and from a humanitarian point of view. And just one other thing, which is, of course, the relationship with the US administration, a very unpredictable administration where Donald Trump is saying we're going to get aid to Gaza, but is also, blaming Hamas for the
Right.
impossibility of it. So it's a very fraught moment, I would say, filled with uncertainty, and the portents are not particularly good. The experience of the last 18 months in how Israel has tried to destroy Hamas in terms of the threat it poses, to weaken Hamas to the point where it will be prepared to release more hostages. Yes, many hostages have come home, but now we're down to the 59 and the maybe 24 who are still alive. Hamas will not easily give up that crucial leverage, and it is not clear that this will be more effective or how much support Israel will have internationally and how widely supported. Or it is clear that within Israel, at the moment at least, you have to say, it would appear to not to be widely supported, with the onus on, again, a people's army that is fighting it. So a divided country and a somewhat uncertain plan.
I want to mention a meme that I saw on social media this morning very briefly of a young woman sitting with a baby on her lap, a caricature, and around her are the word bubbles of all the things that she's thinking about. Call up for reservists or not being called up, a strike on kindergartens and preschools that's going on right now for the third day in a row. So you can't get to work because you have to be home with your kids. Hostages, another word bubble. Go to the protest, not go to the protest. Go back into Gaza, not go back into Gaza. And so these are the things that people are thinking about on a daily basis and trying to deal with. Very much so. Okay, let's take a quick break. When we're back, we'll just talk briefly about comments made by U.S. Special Envoy to the Mideast, Steve Witkoff, and just briefly the cabinet's rejection of the Attorney General's call for a state commission probe into October 7th. So stay with us.
Israel Bonds, the heartbeat of solidarity, the powerhouse of support. When the Israeli-Hamas war hit, Israel Bonds stood tall, proving we're more than just an investment, we're a lifeline. Israel Bonds pledges to ensure Israel thrives and flourishes. Investing in Israel Bonds isn't just a financial move, it's a declaration for resilience, strength, and a better future for Israel. Join us and let solidarity echo through generations.
Let's start with the cabinet's rejection of the Attorney General's call for the probe of October 7th. She wanted it to be something that was not political in nature. The cabinet is rejecting that call for a non-political probe. Not surprising. This has been going on, obviously, for months, since October 7th, 2023. Does this mean it's over and done until a new government possibly comes into power, or what happens now?
Well, the Attorney General required the government to tell to make clear whether or not it was going to proceed with a commission of inquiry, ideally with a state commission of inquiry, she said, because that's, as we've said so many times, the most potent body. It can issue subpoenas, it issues recommendations, and so on. And the government, as far as we know, again, not entirely clear. I'm not sure there was an official statement, but there was stuff coming out that we've reported saying, no, we're not going to do this. And talking about, again, the government decided. I'm not sure. Some ministers said in principle that maybe there can be a state commission of inquiry, but it would be appointed differently. It would not be appointed by the Supreme Court's president. Well, of course, if that's the case, then it's not a state commission of inquiry in the form that it exists legally in Israel to date. So if this were to be the case, it would require legislation. And then who would appoint the members of the committee? And if it's not a credibly independent person, then really it's not a state commission of inquiry. And if it's Knesset appointed or a coalition appointed, then manifestly it's a political inquiry. We can have no doubt the Prime Minister, and he's the only relevant person in this story, does not want a state commission of inquiry. I think he believes it would be terminal for his political career. And the Attorney General and that vast majority, even more than 70% in most of the polls I've seen of Israelis who want it, the desire is not punitive. The desire is to make sure that this can't happen again. You know, what went wrong? How did Israel screw up so badly? Why did it refuse to read all the evidence that it had, to take note, and at least be prepared in the eventuality that its intelligence assessment that Hamas was not interested in an escalation and a war, if that turned out to be wrong? And then how it has fought subsequently. I mean, these are things that are obviously necessary. This has to be done independently. There are limitations. We've seen them at the IDF's probes that our friend and colleague Emmanuel Fabian writes about, because they come out all the time, but they have not ventured into politics. The Shin Bet probe, incredibly controversial because Netanyahu has been firing the head of the Shin Bet, who of course is now given his resignation date. That did touch on political failure and provoked a firestorm because the Shin Bet had the temerity in its public summation, and never mind in its private summation, to make clear that there was, failure at every level, in every echelon, notably including the political echelon. We've got a reality here where 75% of the public is saying we need a state commission of inquiry. We need to get to the truth, and a government that is refusing to do this. I don't know how this is going to play out. As you said, it's not surprising. This is the government's position, and it's the government argument has been people don't trust the judges to do this honestly. But so much of the mistrust of the judiciary is engendered very strategically by the government, which has fought since before October the 7th, from its very first days in office, to drastically restrict the role of the judiciary, to constrain its independence, and so on. Just one other thing I would say that we haven't
Yeah.
mentioned is the Attorney General's concern is also that if Israel is not credibly able to investigate itself in lots of forums because its judiciary is being reduced. And this is part of that argument. That's going to be very harmful for Israel in terms of international forums and so on. So there's the domestic element of this, and there's also, again, coming back to that point that we made, that we started making long before October the 7th, that if you're going to deny Israel's judiciary of its independence, you're going to bring levels of international scrutiny, including by some bodies that are very hostile to Israel, and you're not going to have an effective legal, judicial, international response to those efforts to basically impose outside oversight on how Israel runs its country,
Right.
fights its wars, and so on.
Okay, let's wrap it up with just the comments that Steve Witkoff, the U.S. Special Envoy to the Mideast, made at the Israeli embassy in Washington. This was on Monday. And he urged Israelis to, quote, choose unity over division, end quote. Called it a bittersweet Independence Day, given, of course, the 59 hostages who are still in Gaza tunnels. Were you surprised that he was there? Were you expecting those comments? Thoughts?
I don't think it's surprising that Steve Witkoff wanted to go to an
Right.
Israel independence event at the embassy. I don't think anyone has any doubt of that Steve Witkoff's heart is with Israel. This is a guy who's been given astonishing degrees of responsibility by the president in so many arenas, many of which are central to us, which I think is beyond the capabilities of anybody. So I hope he has very, very good teams in every arena in which he's active. And we know, before we get into the substance of what he said, that on the Iranian front, which is pretty crucial to our most literal well-being here, there's been some confusion. His initial forays into talks with the Iranians, they must have been delighted because he talked about, hey, we need to verify that they're capping their uranium enrichment, and we need to verify that they're not weaponizing. And he certainly did not say, but of
Stop
course,
this.
this is irrelevant because we're going to demand they dismantle their nuclear facilities. He didn't say that after the first round of talks. He said it a day after he had not said it, when I assumed there'd been a lot of frantic phone calling. The talks with Iran have not created a sense in Israel, shall we say, that the Americans are outsmarting or at least negotiating at eye level with the very cynical and very expert and very nuclear weapons oriented Iranian regime. So that's pretty worrying. But his unity plea, my goodness, Independence Day passed. It was beyond surreal that because of the fires, well, they'd actually been started by very high winds, so the live ceremony for Independence Day evening had been called off anyway. But then the fires began to spread, and we had this. It wasn't like a metaphor for Israel on fire. It was Israel on fire, right? And you're
Israel
cutting
fine. Right.
from a pre-recorded Independence Day ceremony to and most of the channels actually did show most of the ceremony, even as some of the worst wildfires we've ever had in Israel were
For being
burning.
fought.
I mean,
Right.
literally, the main TV station had to evacuate their studio in mid-broadcast that evening. That's never happened before. So you have a country on fire, literally, and you have a country that's so terribly divided, as we talk about all the time. And you have an envoy with his heart in the right place saying, guys, this is so harmful to you. You have to get it together. And of course, the supporters of Prime Minister Netanyahu would argue that's everybody else who is dividing the country. And doesn't he always say we have to be unified and we'll win together and
Right.
so on?
He's saying the same thing.
Right, but I don't think that we're being unfair. And speaking for myself, this is the Prime Minister who fosters disunity, who blames anybody who says basically that anyone who disagrees with him is part of the left who cannot be trusted with the security of Israel. But you're the Prime Minister. You've been the Prime Minister for most of everybody's living memory in this country. It's on you, and yet refusing to take responsibility when things go wrong, deflecting blame, stirring up the public against the judiciary, arguing with the head of the domestic secret service. It's a very, very problematic environment in this very precious, vulnerable country. And just, again, I feel sorry to somehow seem that I'm repeating myself, but it is obvious now, including to people who are well disposed towards Israel from outside, that it's such a weakness. That we don't have the luxury. When people all around are trying to destroy this country, we have to hold it together and we have to work together. And good for Steve Witkoff for issuing the plea. I think all Israelis who care for this country should be endorsing it and working for it.
But it will probably fall on deaf ears to those who need to hear it.
In some circles. Well, let's hope not.
Let's hope not. Okay. Thank you, David. Thanks for being with me today. And thanks for listening to the Daily Briefing. We'll be back again tomorrow with another installment. This episode is produced by the Podwaves, with our video produced by Thomas Gersh. If you have comments about this or other episodes, drop us an email, podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next time, take care. Have yourselves a good day.